All right, so welcome everyone. We're going to be talking about operationalizing a threat journal program for you, as well as what it gets you and how you can do it. We'll start by talking briefly about what a threat intelligence program is, what it entails, what are some of the basic features of having a program, what are the basic outcomes, and then we'll get into the nitty-gritty of how you can actually automate some of the more complex parts of it so that you have the ability to then take your tier 1s up to a tier 3 level in functionality, but not necessarily in knowledge base or practice. So, quick blurb about me. I'm Christian. Nice to meet everyone. I also go by Guardian Cosmos, or Cosmos by most of my friends, because they're all too lazy to say my full handle. I was previously the pen testing and threat intelligence lead for KPMG. I both developed and ran the service line. I moved on to be the Foundstone threat researcher that specialized in SOC build-out and threat intelligence programs build-out, as well as some of the IR and pen testing services. I actually spent my last year redesigning completely one of the SOCs for the Fortune 5. My side gig is I'm also one of the SMEs for SANS. I do a lot of for the last 5 years, I've done a lot of the course audits, question authoring, and I also am an instructor for 560 and 504. So that's your GPEN and your GCIH courses. So I like to jump right into these things. First, let's talk about threat intel. Threat intel is really the sugar and spice on top of all of your security programs. It gives you that context, and I'm going to come back to that word a lot because it's one of the most important words when you're talking about threat intelligence. So, considering that, why do we need threat intelligence? Threat intelligence gives us the context to know how to deal with the attacks that we're facing. It also can potentially give us the advantage over our adversaries by allowing us to make preemptive moves knowing that we might be attacked in a certain fashion. In doing so, it gives us a lot of different advantages. So threat intelligence, from a non-cyber perspective, is typically viewed as having intelligence on your adversaries, as well as being able to predict their movements. The same context perpetrates down into a cyber perspective. Now, in a cyber perspective, it can allow us to preemptively select things we might want to patch in advance to help protect against known threats in the wild, or threats that we might think are on the rise. For example, when MS-0867 came out back in the day, those companies that had already been early adopters of the threat intelligence program had already been the first on that patch list. So they were already communicating with Microsoft in order to make sure that those DLLs and that NAND vulnerability was being patched prior to the public disclosure of it. So that's a little bit about what it is, how we can use it, and how we can really get started with the program. So let's say you got your CISO, he has the buzzword, tomorrow we want to start a threat intelligence program. What does that look like, what does that entail, and what do you need? So to start a threat intelligence program, the barrier to entry is actually pretty low. You really just need an analyst who has the ability and the knowledge and the skill set to start doing intelligence. There are lots of open source tools and utilities. There's things like VirusTotal, you have the OTX Threat Exchange if you're looking for IOCs or to start at a baseline. But even less than that, the basics of threat intelligence really come down to adding context to already known pieces of data. So, for example, your organization subscribes to a news feed. Generally, it could be Yahoo News, it could be just CNET, it could be CNN, whatever news that you want to subscribe to. Having that analyst actually on a daily basis go ahead, collect and curate that news before the C-suite level executives have a chance to view it in the news and freak out about it, and then come down to the analyst and ask the questions. Being able to actually write a little blurb that says, hey, this is the non-technical breakdown, this is why we should or should not be concerned, and this is what it means to us as an organization. That at its core, that context part, is threat intelligence. So as I mentioned, one of the use cases of this is to prevent FUD. So FUD is our fear, our doubt, and our misunderstanding of our actual threat landscape. So one of the things that threat intelligence can provide you is instead of having your executive go out ahead of time and see the article in the news, perfect example, Equifax, Apache, and Struts vulnerabilities became a really big thing. Those of us in the intelligence community have already been talking about Struts for months and months and months in advance of that breach. And we were already informing our clients, hey, you really should patch this. We haven't seen it in the wild yet, but it's an easy, outward-facing vulnerability. So if you guys were in one of the earlier talks that they were doing here about reconnaissance, one of the things he said is he's going to go to Shodan, he's going to look for whatever is out there already. There's, from our keynote this morning, Amory touched on Autosploit, which was that collaboration between Shodan and Metasploit. These are both really good methods that a lot of attackers and adversaries, both high level and low level, are going to use in their first phases of attack. Having a threat intelligence program really helps to prepare you to prevent something like that. So desirable outcomes. What are some of the desirable things that we can get immediately out of our threat intel program? We have our analyst. Our analyst knows our environment. They know how to contextualize data for an environment, and they have a basic understanding of multiple technical disciplines. So they have a basic IR understanding, a business understanding, and they also have a forensics understanding. So they can speak to each of the contexts. Now we can start deciding, well, do we want to have a daily feed? Do we want to have a weekly feed or a monthly feed? The easiest one to normally start with is a monthly feed. I like to estimate on average that for a monthly feed you need about 8 analyst hours per month to generate that one newsletter. And we'll talk about what that newsletter will consist of in just a little bit. Now, if you were going to go to something like a weekly newsletter, you would probably want to dedicate at least 8 hours per week as opposed to 8 hours per month for that newsletter. That gives the analyst plenty of time to curate, contextualize, understand, digest, and then give you a business readable output. Now, you might also want to consider having different levels of output from your threat intel program. And what I mean by that is it's really good for a part of your security awareness program as your wider user base to have an opt-in program or opt-in newsletter where anyone in your organization can opt in for a security context newsletter. Now, there are use cases where you might not want all of the data that you're putting in this newsletter to be publicly available. So, similar to how the FBI and other three-letter organizations use CERT emails to distribute between tech leaders of companies that are relevant to them, your threat intelligence program, because that's really just a larger threat intel program and sharing program. When you see like FSISAC and all the ISACs, those are really just large, group-funded, crowdsourced intel programs. So when you're internalizing your program, you want to make use of those, and you want to be able to emulate those functionalities. So when you have your daily, weekly, or monthly feeds, you might consider having two. One for public consumption within your company, and one that's specifically for the security personnel that's restricted. That way, any sensitive data that you put in the restricted email doesn't become public domain. So we talked a little bit about some of the skills needed, and I'm just going to highlight them one more time here. Right? You need someone who can be a critical thinker, someone who understands and has the ability to contextualize that data. Again, I'm going to come back to that word a lot. You know, I'm not a fan of buzzwords, but in this case, context really matters. Organizational awareness. Having someone who is really, really good at pen testing, IR, and forensics and has a good understanding of all those practices, but doesn't have an understanding of your organization, what your network looks like, is not really beneficial to you. A lot of cases, when we take threat intel, because it's all around the context, there might be a mitigated control. So a threat that is normally rated a 10 on a CVSS score might actually only be a 5 for your organization because A, it's protecting something of nominal value, or B, it might be higher than a 10 for you because it's protecting something of great significance to you. Conversely, there also might be a mitigated control. So, perfect example of this. Certain applications that are web-facing, if you have a WAF in front of that, and the WAF has a particular signature that you know will block an attack, that's a mitigated control. So regardless of whether or not that server is now patched, in this example we use Apache Struts, if I have all the signatures that I could think of for Apache Struts, I can say I've thoroughly mitigated control. Now, I'm not advocating for not patching and using mitigating controls. Mitigating controls should only ever be used as a temporary fix, but it is a way to give you a larger period of time to do your testing and make sure you don't break your production applications. The ability to identify key assets. So that comes back to my previous point, right? We need to know where are our keys to the kingdom. What is important to us as a business? One of the things that I like to talk about a lot is in security, you need to win. Your goal as a security provider on the defensive side, and even on the offensive side, is to win. And it's impossible as a defender to say, I am going to successfully block every attack. So how do I win as a security provider? I redefine what I consider winning to be. So if I am a credit card company, and my keys to the kingdom are the PII and the credit card data, and that's sitting in a database that's encrypted at rest, and also encrypted during transit, I don't really care. You can botnet my entire organization and have complete control over every endpoint. If you can't decrypt that data, I've still won. You have control over everything in my organization. but the thing that's important to me is still mine. So identifying the key asset and what really matters, and having that context, there's the word again, is really what makes this possible. Scripting and automation, while not mandatory, is really, really useful for a threat intelligence analyst. And this allows them to do a lot of automation and minimize those number of hours that are actually required to generate these news feeds. Now, you can't replace that analyst entirely via automation because what you're really looking for is that critical thinking, that ability to contextualize, and that's not something that we have the ability to replace. But we could save a couple hours in going to different news sites and having an automated digest that we can now, as the analyst, go through and then start writing our blurbs after we digest the information. Context matters. I will scream that from the rooftop. Anyone who has a threat intelligence conversation and does not talk about context does not know what they're talking about, because that's all threat intel is. Threat intel is context. If you ever get into a vendor conversation with a threat intelligence provider and they don't say the word context, kick them out and go pick again, because you're not picking the right ones. So, boiling down into that newsletter, what does the process of developing a newsletter look like? First, you have your analysts collect their news articles. So your analyst is going to go out, and they can do this either manually, automated, they could use something like Feedly, they can do it via scripts, and have a list of sources that you've predefined as things that you like. They're going to go visit these sites. They're going to pick articles that seem interesting and potentially relevant to them as the client. Then they're going to read and digest. Now, the reason we allocate so much time in threat intelligence for generating something that might appear to be just a simple newsletter that you feel like someone could have written in an hour or so is because we really want that analyst to be able to digest and understand what they're reading. When Spectre and Meltdown came out, Google had put out some really, really good write-ups on the vulnerabilities and what they actually entailed. And there was a lot of overreaction in the beginning, similar to what happened with Rowhammer. So those of you who aren't familiar with Rowhammer, Rowhammer was a very theoretical experiment in which using magnets and other electromagnetic fields, we could actually cause a bit jump in an electrical field within a chip and cause data to be written. Now, the really cool thing about that was you can do it, and there's actually now a remote version of that works. But when I say works, I'm going to put the air quotes up for that one. It works in a lab environment because it has to have perfect conditions to be successful. And even then, on last estimate, it was only successful about 52 to 67% of the time. And I try to be specific. Facts are important. Now, the reason for this was due to the nature of the attack. Without having actually understood the full Meltdown, just like with Meltdown and Spectre, without understanding what speculative execution actually was, you could not contextualize that to your environment and prioritize your patching. The difficulty of execution of an attack is one of the most vital pieces of information threat intelligence can gather for you, because that tells you what your priority really is. So we're going to our contextualization phase, right? We're digesting our articles. We want our analysts to go out, read the article, understand the article, find the sources, vet the sources that are referenced in the article, and do their own research. We want to make sure that they're not just creating an article out of one source. We want to make sure we exhaust all of our sources on the topic. Finally, we want to decide if we're going to divide between two or more newsletters. Are we saying that the data we contextualize to a certain extent should only be available to certain members of our security team? For example, are we placing ourselves at risk by allowing anyone in the organization to know, hey, there's this really, really bad vulnerability that we're really vulnerable to, and someone could exploit tomorrow and we'd be dead as a company? That's probably not something that I want anyone in my company to know, because they might be afraid, they might start looking for other jobs, they might be motivated to disclose this for monetary or personal gain, and that creates another risk for me. So managing risk is also the part of the threat intelligence providers. We want to make sure that we're contextualizing the data to the right people at the right time, and making sure that the people who are receiving our data are the people who are privileged to that data. And finally, you have the output of our process, which is one or more newsletters. In the most basic form, it's typically going to be an opt-in newsletter that we publish on our internal website and say, hey guys, if you guys are interested in security, or you're one of those news-mindedly people, and you're going out and you're reading the news every day, and then freaking out because, oh my God, there's this email credit harvesting thing I heard about. What happens if I get the fish? Well, I now know that, okay, my organization is doing something about it. This is what our mitigating controls are. This is what's in front of me, and this is what's protecting me as a member of this organization. And then your mandatory restricted info letter, which normally would consist of strictly your security teams, and only the heads of those teams. So anyone who would be privileged to an FBI letter, a yellow paper, any of those things, those are typically the people you would want to be on your restricted list. Now, I always include so what signs. Every presentation I do always has a so what, because I never want anyone to leave a presentation I do and be like, that's great, that was cool, what did I do, how do I use that? So we're going to come back to this in a second, and one of the things we're going to come back to is what does it actually cost me to have a threat intelligence program, and what's my return on investment look like? Because one of the hardest things to justify in security is your return on investment, and you can't justify a budget to your CISO when you're asking for money for all these cool tools if they don't know what they're getting out of it. So, we've talked about threat intelligence, we talked a little bit about what it was, we've talked about how to start a program. Now, I'm going to teach you one of the more advanced stages. How do we automate this? How do we operationalize it and make it a part of our daily workflows? What are we going to do to make this usable to our analysts? Well, I'm glad you asked. And we have a couple of requirements that we're going to talk about here to make this usable to our analysts in a very effective and automated manner. Now, we need a platform. For the sake of examples that I'm going to be demonstrating here today, we'll be using Maltego. For those of you who aren't familiar, Maltego was developed by Paterva. It is a threat intelligence platform that's predominantly used for gathering data via APIs. We're also going to need some source data. Now, I'm going to show you two examples, and I'm going to talk a lot about the difference between the two. One of them is going to be strictly from an external perspective and what can be done with that data. And the second is going to be a more in-depth model that leverages lots of data that you have internally already and you're already collecting. So for our source data, we're going to be using VirusTotal as our external threat intelligence platform resource, our tip. We'll also be using local network data and data logs. Now, the last thing, and the most important part of a threat intelligence program, and we talked about it a little already, is people. So when automating and operationalizing a threat intelligence program, there's two roles that are really important. And in smaller organizations, this role may be shared. And this is why I talked about earlier, one of the skills that might be really good to have is scripting for the automation purposes. So you're going to need someone who's good at customization, orchestration, someone who's really good at scraping websites, reading and writing from APIs, and making tools work together and play nice with one another. Integrations. Personally, I program in half a dozen different languages. I can list those all day. And for me, the one that works best right now is Python. That's my personal current favorite. That's always subject to change. The second part you need is that threat intelligence analyst, the person who's going to actually add all the context that makes this data usable. So, because we're going to be talking about Maltego in this scenario, I'll offer you up towards the end a couple different alternatives. There's plenty of open source things. You can use things like Crits, if you're using the Hive or Mist. These are all things that you can do. If you're using something more commercial, if you're using an Atlassian product like Jira to manage your tickets, or if you're using something like Snow, ServiceNow, Zendesk, any of those, it is possible to add integrations on top of this that help you to do these different things that we're going to talk about here. Same thing if you're using directly out of your SIEM and you're using your SIEM's built-in case management utilities, or you're using SIEM integrations. A lot of the things we're about to talk about are still possible within there. And I'll talk about, as we go through, why I like Maltego and graph-based platforms for this particular approach. So what I have up here is an environment setup. This is actually a diagram, again, from Paterva's website, because we're going to be using Maltego in this example. And I'll talk about, I know there's a lot of stuff on here. We'll talk about what's mandatory to make this process work and what's optional. So of the things on the end here, we have to start with a client. These are optional. The differences between them, again, they're Maltego specific. This will vary as your mileage will with different products. In this case, we have Classic, XL, and CE. The difference between them is the number of objects you can have on a single screen at a time. Community Edition is free. You can have 12 objects on your screen at a time and return 12 objects at a time. Then you move up to Classic, which is 10,000, and XL, which is unlimited. So that's your platform. That's where we're going to view and manipulate our data. The next thing we're going to need is a server of some sort. The server is going to be our gateway to our data. So Maltego has two different options. They have commercial transform servers. In the context of Maltego, what a transform is it's a pre-built script that does the work for you. It goes out, it gathers the data, processes it, parses it, and brings it into your view. The commercial transform data server is going to be hosted by Maltego in their cloud. You can opt for an on-site edition of it for various privacy reasons, so that you're not exposing yourself by potentially giving your attacker an idea of what you're looking up about them. And really that just is a lot of nice things that Maltego has already built for you. Integrations with a lot of commercial products and a lot of commercial tips. Things like CrowdStrike, Recorded Future, Big IP, Mind Map, all the things are really already built into the commercial transforms. It saves you a lot of time and development money. The other thing that they use is an internal transform server. So internal transform server here, for the example that I'm going to demonstrate, is pretty mandatory. What that does for you is it allows you to actually access the data, parse it locally, and it also allows you to distribute it amongst multiple clients, as opposed to just doing everything locally on your client. If you were to do everything locally on your client, you can still make this work. It's just a little more heavy on the management. And I'll talk towards the end of the presentation about some of the costs associated with this particular approach, and then we can also talk about what costs might look like for different product ranges. If anyone, I'll leave that open to the Q&A section, and we can talk about what products you guys have in your organizations or you're familiar with, and I can pull from my experience what those cost models look like for each different product. The next thing is the most important in here. That's your transform server. Your transform server can actually be the same server as your distribution server or your commercial transform server. All that means is the transform server is representative of where your code base is going to live for your transforms. Again, in this case, that's just different sets of scripts that will actually go out and gather the data and do something. Think of the transform as the thing that does the thing. Right? So you have two different data sources we're going to talk about here. You have public data sources. Public data sources might consist of things like your public DNS, online databases like VirusTotal, PassiveTotal, Hybrid Analysis, search engines like Google, Bing, Yahoo, Ask, social media, Facebook, Twitter. Twitter is one of the bigger ones. Facebook has gotten a lot more restrictive in how you can actually access their data. They've limited access to the Graph API. So if your organization is not one of those organizations privileged to that, that might not be an option for you any longer, unfortunately. Online APIs, so really the sky is the limit. If there is an API or if you can simulate human interaction, you can interact with that and pull that data. And of course that leaves it open to any other public data source. Now the internal data sources, this is where you're going to have to do a lot of your development because there aren't any commercial transforms that Maltego offers openly and freely to you for your internal data. And because everyone's data and their organizational structure is different, your mileage may vary with the amount of development you might need to do to get this data. So internal APIs, if you're using Splunk, if you're using ESM, if you're using QRadar, any of your SIMs, they all have open APIs. You can dump the data in here and make queries. System logs, if you're using another utility, if you want to pull directly from syslog, if you're a small organization and you only have a few servers, you can do it that way. Internal servers like your AD servers, your DNS servers, if you're doing DNS management via something like IP blocks to make sure that you're managing your different DNS allocations, you might want to pull that data in, and any other internal data feeds you might have. One of those internal data feeds might actually be your intelligence newsletter. You might want to pull that in so that you can link it via specific IOCs that you place in those newsletters or tags specifically for this use case. Alright, so I've talked a lot about a lot of things. So I'm actually going to show you a demo of two different scenarios that are based around the same core scenario and what the difference between using strictly public data and strictly internal and public data look like. Again, this is in the context of Maltego. Your experiences will be a little different depending on what platforms you choose to use. So, all I've done here is I've started with an unknown attacker. That's just an empty graphic. It's just a way for me to visualize what I'm doing. I've identified in my organization that there's this malicious executable that's doing things that it shouldn't be, called diskpart.exe. For the sake of this example, we'll consider that it was either flagged by IAV or we were able to find it during a hunt. I'm now able to take that piece and I'm going to resolve that to a hash. I can compute it manually, I can look it up based on what I know, it might already be available to me. That hash, I've actually only right-clicked on that icon and I've gotten all this data. So all that data was pulled via the VirusTotal API, via the public data transform, which is freely available from Altigo for every user. Now what's really cool about this is I've taken the VirusTotal tip, given it my hash, and gotten all the goodiness data back from VirusTotal and put it right on my graph. So it's really easy for me to manipulate. And all of this was done in a matter of seconds via a right click. That's the beauty of this typical automation approach, is that wonderfulness of having all your data from many sources in one platform. Now, if you're paid for a private subscription to something like OpsSWAT or PassiveTotal or a premium VirusTotal intelligence account, you could also put those API keys in here and use that data as well. Now, what's really cool is I have every AV's signature, a hash. I can search for mutexes, and I can now cross-search this back through my organization. I've used that hash and the information I got from VirusTotal to resolve it to WannaCry. So I know, hey, this sample, this diskpart.exe file that was acting nasty, well, now I can tell you it's WannaCry. So this is from a strictly public perspective, right? We haven't done anything really significant yet that required any internal data or automated anything yet. So let's look at what that would look like. This is the same chart after I've added some special transforms that I've written and automated here. Now, you'll notice we still have our unknown actor icon, we still have our disk part that we identified, and we resolved it to the hash. All these arrows that you see, I don't know how well you guys in the back can see them, are actually just relationship arrows that are pointed and directed towards how we derived our data. So one of the reasons I like using graph-based platforms for this is because as humans, we function in a neural network manner, which means that we function as a neural graph. That's how our brains actually function, that's how neurons fire. Which means that for most individuals, looking at a spreadsheet or columns of data is not as efficient or easy to understand for the average person as something like a graph. And that's really how you take your tier 1, who just knows how to look at data and right-click and do something but doesn't really understand it. This is how you can make that tier 3 level function of gathering the intelligence and using it accessible to your tier 1s and 2s. So now, let's talk about the new things that are on this diagram. We talked about the sample, the hash, we've talked about the mutexes we pulled back from VirusTotal. Let's talk about what's new here. So one of the things that I was able to do via an integration, I pulled in some logs, and I've identified that this particular sample actually came in through a spam email. Someone opened a link, there was either a malicious attachment or they visited a website. In this case, we're going to say that it was an attachment. It was on Christian@Tesla.com's email. That's where it came from. So we can actually right-click on that, and there's a transform that's going to run in the back end that we've developed that'll go search our Active Directory instances and say, hey, who owns Christian@Tesla.com? Whose email address is that? And it's going to resolve us to a user. And they say, hey, Christian Nicholson knows that email address. Okay, that's great. Now, what machine is it on? What machines does he own? In this scenario, we're going to hypothesize that I only have one machine, but if I had multiple, that would be good to know and show up here. So the way we're going to resolve the machine is we're going to make a query to our asset management database. So if you guys are using ServiceNow and you're maintaining an asset inventory via CMDB, or if you're using Manage Engine, or if you're using Nagios, Spiceworks, whatever you guys are using, you're going to make a query to that and say, hey, can you correlate this user to machines? And then give me the machine names and their IP addresses. And I'm going to store all that information in that node. So that's really cool. I have a relationship now between the unknown actor, an email account, the user who owns the email, the machine that that piece of email was delivered to, and where the malware is likely sitting, and I can cross-correlate that back to identify, yes, in fact, that is where the malware is. Now I have that relationship as well. So I know that some file named diskpart.exe from some unknown actor, which we know resolves to this hash, which we know is a sample of WannaCry, and has these mutexes, is in our environment. That's great. Now let's do something about that. So now that I have all the mutexes and I have the hash, I want to find other machines in my environment with the same sample or things that are known mutexes. So underlying here, I right-clicked on that sample again and used the source data from below to do another query via custom transform. Unfortunately, I can't show you all the custom transforms. I just don't have enough time. I'll show you an example of the basic one on the next slide. And a lot of those are very proprietary to the client you develop them for and internal to yourself. So it's really hard to show those in a presentation like this. But In the Q&A, please do feel free to ask me what's involved in parsing that data and obtaining that data, or we can discuss it privately. That way it's more contextualized for you as well. So now I've taken that hash, I've searched across my entire organization. This could be via, if you're using a whitelisting tool, or if you have a Cylance in your environment, a CrowdStrike, anything that's logging the different various hashes. If you have the ability via your EDR tool to actually spin off a search on every endpoint to identify a hash, you can create that integration as well. So I've now identified 3 more computers with WannaCry on it, and I've resolved those, again, via the same transform as previously, only in reverse, same as doing a DNS forward versus reverse lookup, to 3 more users. So now I know I have 4 total infected users, 1 mutex, and 4 computers that I have to remediate. And I know that it's WannaCry. Awesome, right? Now, if I wanted to, I can take this a step further, and if I'm using the EDR tool in my environment, I could add additional custom transforms that take the data out of Maltego and actually go either quarantine those machines, remediate those machines where possible, run virus scans on those machines. Again, the beauty of using an approach like this and automation is you're limited only by what kind of data you have access to, what kind of tools you have access to, and what you can program. So we'll talk about after this what a transform looks like. So, what does an under the hood transform look like if we're going to write our own? So this is just a basic Python one. Maltego supports multiple languages. It supports Perl, Shell Script, Python, and I believe Ruby under the hood. Out of box, you can add custom integrations for different languages, so you can use whatever you prefer. And this is just a basic search. So we're going to use the Maltego transform library. We're going to import that. In this case, I also have an auxiliary file that I've written called LDAP Manager, which manages my LDAP queries. For this example of code, we're going to be talking about how I resolved the users and machines to IP addresses and the user and email. So I'm going to have this Maltego transform that I'm going to instantiate here. I'm then going to create this variable that's going to store my LDAP resolution. So I'm just going to call that LDAP res. I'm going to make a call to my LDAP manager, which has a sub-function called user query, which takes an input of an email address. So it's going to take the email address I put in here, which I actually use my corporate email address for this example, christian@indelible.global. And I'm going to do a resolution. So I've actually put an abstract here of what the data that is returned actually looks like. So I've been returned back a object class, which in this case was an inet.org person, POISX account, and a shadow account. So in this case, I was querying an open LDAP server because I was running a Linux environment for this particular example. My UID was Christian, that's my username. My surname was Nicholson. My given name, Christian. So this is just, like I said, what you would expect to get back from any open LDAP query, right? Now I've added a couple other things on the back end that I've queried in my LDAP manager script as auxiliary data. So you also notice at the bottom that I've asked for my last known IP and last known machine name. Something really cool to note about this particular implementation is if you're familiar with Python, you'll have noticed that all of the variables, it's a dictionary made up of lists. And the reason for that is, what if I have multiple items? So in the case of an object class, I have multiple object classes. What if I had more than one email or more than one email alias? What if I had more than one last known IP? So if I'm retaining all my IPs and I have an implementation like IP blocks in my environment, I could actually go back and get the last 5 or 10 known IP addresses and then cross-correlate and make sure that there's no other infected machines if I own multiple devices. And the last known machine name. So again, we're just going to do a quick DNS lookup for that one. So now all of this data gets returned to me. I'm going to parse it out, and I'm going to use this entity. So I'm going to create a new entity. An entity in Maltego language is every one of those nodes that you saw on that map. Each one is an entity, and each one has a data type. So in this case, we're going to be making a person data type, because we're referencing a user. So I'm going to say, I want to add a new entity using, again, I'm going to use my Maltego transform object here. I'm going to make a subclass called mt.addEntity. I'm going to tell it that it's a person object. You could also define custom objects if you have, custom servers or applications, or you want to make it more expansive. It is supported by the transforms library. I'm going to provide it LDAP res, and I'm going to say give it variable 1 to start with, which is my username. I'm going to also tell it to set the type. So we're setting the type, again, to a Maltego.person, which is a class that's already instantiated in my Maltego library. It basically says, hey, this is a person type variable. And the reason that that's really important and useful is that's going to drive what type of transforms you can use. Maltego is very context aware. So if you're clicking on an IP versus a hash, it'll provide different options of what types of transforms you can run. And when you write a transform, you're going to define what types of objects it should work on. So it's really helpful for organization. You'll never try and run a DNS lookup on a person's name, because obviously you're not going to really expect any results from that. I'm going to set a value. So the value is the actual data that I'm concerned with, which again is going to be the first object in here. And I'm also going to set an entity weight. What the entity weight means is in my graph, if I wanted to do a weight distribution to make it easier or more visible, or I wanted certain entities to hold a higher value and therefore be more visible as I'm dragging objects around, that's what the weight does. It's really just a visual helpful identity, and it defines your importance level of the object you were discussing in Maltego world. I'm then going to tell it what's my display going to look like, what should the text that I see on my screen underneath the icon say, and do I have any additional custom fields? In this case, I do. I have all this data here I want to be tied to those objects, so I'm going to assign that data to the additional fields object. And what that'll do is it'll actually automatically create via the library each field, which in the Maltego interface will actually come up in a separate user pane that's very easy to see. Then I'm going to tell it to send a message to the user and let me know, hey, just give me a little pop-up that says, yeah, I completed my task. I've run everything in the background. It succeeded. You can get fancy here. Again, this is just a basic example. You could add error handling. If you require API keys and they're missing, you could add handling in here for that as well. Again, it's really extensible, so you're limited only by your imagination. And then I'm going to tell it to return the output onto my screen. And that's how I got all those custom nodes. All right. So before I move on, we're going to come back to the so what. Before we talk about so what, I just want to offer you some alternative platform options. We talked a little bit about using something like Mist, Crits, or anything else you have in your environment. Like I said, really the sky is the limit. You can swap out your data for whatever data you want to use. I've actually taken this approach, and this approach was actually really inspired by a completely arbitrary other thing. So there's this really big tool by Palantir called Gotham that was designed for big data manipulation. For those of you who are familiar with it, it's predominantly an HR tool, and they've added a cyber module onto it. It's just another giant graph-based database. It's very expensive and inaccessible to a lot of people, which really led me to develop this approach for myself. This is also the approach that I used as an MSSP model at a variety of different jobs I've held in the past when I delivered this service to a client. Now, some of the other interesting things that you can do here, like I said, we touched a little bit on, you could add integrations to actually go out and do something with your data. You could have auto-report generation. You can use these graphs to auto-generate tickets for you and maintain ticket notes. Again, because it's all automated, your limitation is really only by what kind of tools you have accessible, what you want to integrate, and what you have the ability to program. So I promised we would come back to the so what moment. So the so what moment here really comes down to a couple key facts. So the exact implementation that I just showed you on this screen, using the tools that I showed you to the maximum capacity, would cost me about $100,000 in my first year. Now that gets me a VirusTotal private license for using VTI, and that also gets me all the different ancillary Maltego parts that I want for 5 users for the first year. That cost jumps down to about $30,000 in the second year. Again, this is just the pricing model for Maltego. Full disclosure, I'm not affiliated with Viterbo or Maltego at all. I'm just using those as reference prices for your program. So assume that your total output over 2 years is going to be about $170,000. Now, what is your savings? Where is your return on investment on that? You're saving in time. That's really going to be the biggest thing you're going to save on here, is your time that you're outputting. So on average, I've automated the job of a tier 3. Tier 3 as a consultant generally ranges at a price range of about $200 to $350 an hour, depending on your consulting firm. Sometimes it's a little less than that. I've seen it as low as $150. Less skilled consultants that are more at a tier 2 level or tier 1 level normally go up between $80 and $90 if they're more commodity skills. So figure you're saving that much money per hour for every hour that you save. Now, the whole example that I showed you from start to finish of that graph took me less than 5 minutes. Now to get all that data, typically jumping between every interface, identifying where in the interface the data lived, would typically take the average analyst between 30 minutes to an hour. So I've reduced between 30 minutes and an hour's worth of work to about 5 minutes via my automation platform here. And that's not counting if I were to add an EDR tool, either custom or non-custom, on top of this. Now, an alternative to Maltego, if you're a very open source shop, and you don't want to use something like Crits or MISC or something, you can definitely develop something entirely on your own. It's a very simple graph-based database, so you're welcome to use things like GraphViz and all the other wonderful Python libraries out there and develop all of this on your own. You can use things that are already pre-built, like MozDev from Mozilla or GRR from Google, and integrate with those platforms as well with this type of approach. Both of those already include graph-based management platforms inside of them, so you can just build on top of that and still get the same general output look and feel. So overall, I'm saving on average over 2 years. The average employee or consultant is between $115,000 to $140,000 if I were to insource them as a salary. This total cost over 2 years was about $170,000. So figure I'm saving almost $100,000 a year per analyst with this type of implementation. And remember, I'm also making this data accessible to a tier 1 who is far less expensive for me as an employee than a tier 3. There's a couple different other things we can talk about if you want to talk about return on investment on this one. But I really do, I know I'm starting to come close to the end of my time, and I want to leave plenty of time for Q&A. So with that said, I'd like to jump to Q&A. Any questions about threat intelligence in general, the approach I've demonstrated here, what platforms you can use, feel free to shoot your hands up. If not, if you want to just ask me after the presentation, I'm more than happy to cut it a little short so that you can approach individually. I know sometimes that everyone likes to ask questions.
Would you share any tips or nuggets about orientating the threat intelligence program to the business?
Sure, that's an excellent question. The question was, what are some tips about orientating a threat intel program to the business? And it's a really hard question to answer in brief because it's really going to matter, again, we're going to come back to that context matter slide, it's really going to matter what your business is. If you are a financial company, you might want to pull in financial data from some more public sources, or you might have internal sources or spreadsheets that you might want to pull into your platforms in order to identify where your assets are, where your money generating revenues are, and what's important to you to protect. But it's a really good question. Anyone else?
What are some of the more exotic, I guess, data sources you've seen integrated or like automated tooling?
Ooh, that's a really good question that I like a lot. So the question was, what are some of the more exotic toolings and data sources that I've seen or integrated with a solution like this? Gotta think about that one for a minute. There's been some pretty interesting ones. I've actually done ICS and SCADA integrations with stuff like this, which would actually gather environment variables from OT systems and environments. I've gathered performance data from end machines. I'm a really big fan of user analytics. I think that from a threat intelligence perspective, that really helps to predict what might happen. Splunk and doing large Splunk analytics and creating pre-made Splunk reports and analytics observations are other really good data sources to pull into stuff like this, because that really gives you a baseline of what you should expect, and you can then identify the difference there. I think one of the most exotic ones was when I had to split up, we were taking from a ticketing system where we started, getting that data into the platform, manipulating it, enriching it, pulling data from about 20 different sources, and then pushing it back out, and then distributing it to 2 separate ticketing systems, while also managing all the synchronous data. That one was probably one of the most complex and exotic things I've ever had to do. There was a lot of parsing of proprietary formats that had to be done, so it made it a really interesting implementation. Anyone else?
And then, I mean,
has it gone as far as parsing, I don't know, company emails that just say, hey, I'm concerned about this issue, and then it just searches the email for keywords in there and tries to figure out what the threat is, what it's researching?
Yeah, so so the question was around, has it gone as far as to look at company emails and actually read the bodies and get information out of those and then make decisions based on it? So actually, for a recent client of mine who didn't want to buy a phishing solution, we wrote and developed in Python an entire phishing solution that did just that. it would actually go ahead and query for emails that were reported into a particular email box, read them, parse out the body, automatically take and submit all of the URLs, any attachments to every sandbox we had in the environment. So across Cuckoo, Wildfire, VTI, we would submit the hashes as well as the actual samples for analysis in the sandbox, get all of that data back, generate a ticket, pull it into the intelligence platform, and make a decision on it. We also actually added some machine learning in there with keywords to trigger on, so we were able to identify if there was a DLP event occurring in that email as well, or compare it against a list of pre-existing emails or emails we've seen in the past as well. And we did a lot of that with regex. The side project I'm actually currently working on is I've started writing an entire library in Python for doing regex DLP, specifically for another integration into something like this.
So when you're guiding a company on building a threat intel program, are there lessons learned, false assumptions, gotchas that might not be very intuitive that you've kind of discovered along the way?
Definitely. So the question was, are there any gotchas when you're developing a threat intelligence program that I've run into or discovered along the way, and what kind of problems have I run into? A lot of the times, especially when doing like a mass integration like this in a threat intel program, you start to experience a lot of people coming out of the woodworks and asking for access to data that they should never have access to or might not have had access to. And on the same side of that coin, you might find that you start to discover a lot of data that is unknown to your organization, a lot of shadow IT groups that now need to become managed. You're not, as the intelligence analyst who's discovering all these things and asking for access to all these things, you're not always the most well-liked person, because you'll find that you start tramping on some people's stomping grounds, and taking control or making suggestions that they might not like as much. So my best piece of advice, and in my experience, the best thing you can do as you're trying to build these programs to mitigate things like that is build good working relationships with other teams. Follow the best principles of never burn a bridge. And I always like to approach a conversation when I need to ask someone for something. I always like to be prepared with something to offer them in return that I know they're going to want. That really makes those conversations and getting those integrations up and running a lot smoother. Also, having good content and user awareness training ahead of time before you say to your users, hey, we have this really cool security newsletter you could subscribe to, because you'll find that there are a lot of people in your organization who are, they're interested in taking any advantage or any special insider thing that they can get out of your company. They're interested in it just because it makes them feel special because they have something that's restricted. So you'll notice that there are a lot of people might come and ask for these things without having a real good understanding of what the data is, and that's why when I first started building threat intel programs, I used to only ever have one data feed, and I learned very quickly that was a bad idea. And that's why I now say when I present to you, I would really suggest you have two, at minimum, a restricted and a non-restricted. The restricted one normally is better suited for having a very business contextualized high-level blurb, and also very technical details as it relates to your organization. And then the public consumption for your internal company itself is really good for just having that high-level, no nitty-gritty details of why it was mitigated, just that it was mitigated by something you had. Excellent question. Anyone else?
I have one more quick question.
Sure.
In terms of how you define and measure success of an intel program.
That's a really good one. So the question was, how do I measure and determine my success of my intel program? And the answer is really a little bit abstract. Your return on investment and your success of your program is again going to be subject to your definition of success. And before you start building a program, you should really define what your success of the program means. That might be metrics, that might be your definition of success is that you have within your company of 500 people, 100 people subscribe to the public newsletter. Because then you can check a box on your user awareness training and say, yes, my users are aware of security risks that they're facing in their organization. Your success definition might be, I want my CISO to be aware of emerging threats that might affect our organization and how they affect us so that they're better prepared if a reporter asks them, hey, Equifax, did you know ahead of time about this vulnerability that you just got popped on? Or what are you doing to solve this vulnerability? Or mitigate this threat that your competitor is now facing. Those are really important things that you can use to measure success. And your varying for success, your mileage may vary. It's really going to depend on what the goal of your threat intel program is and the reason for instantiating it. If, like many companies, you're instantiating a threat intelligence program because A, it's a buzzword and it's new and hot and popular in the industry right now, and you went to a conference like this and you heard someone talk about threat intel, and we're like, oh cool, that's the thing that I should be doing right now. That's probably not a good reason for you to have a program, and if that's why you want a program, you should really take a step back and decide, well, why do I want it? Jumping back to the beginning of the presentation, talking about what it gets me, and take those things and use those as metrics. Has my intelligence led to me patching something that was then spotted in the wild later on? So did I mitigate that threat? That's a really good metric for threat intel programs. Was I able to prevent something that I know would have otherwise affected me? Did someone who was a peer to me in industry get popped by something that I prevented because of an article I read or because my analyst pointed a flaw out ahead of time? One of the other things that I really didn't mention a lot during the talk is you can really take a purple teaming aspect to this. That's that red plus blue team methodology. You can add vulnerability data in here, pen testing results. One of the most popular integrations that I've done in that graph-based platform was actually taking like Nexpose, Nessus, and Rapid7 data and vulnerability data and cross-correlating it to the threat, because then I can come down and say, all right, this is the threat, you chose to either accept or mitigate the risk, this is why you're now popped. And that really gives you, again, that extra context on what happened, why it cost what it did, and how much it actually could have potentially cost you. All right, if there's no other questions, then thank you guys, you've been a wonderful audience.